business management schools has been a long-standing interest and concern of mine, which I've shared. And I think, I suppose, the circle of people I'm with, people like Professor Henri-Claude de Bettignier, Laszlo Zsolnay, and of course the whole work of the RBBM network is close to this movement to try and engage better with practitioners based whilst facing the reality of the academic rigor and relevance debate that goes on in universities and business schools. So I'm going to try and just get my screen working here, but giving you, I hope, you can see the screen okay, can you? I'm presuming. So here's your academic health warning. I'm a practitioner. Okay, so be warned. You know, anything could happen because, as you probably guessed, although I was a professor of management practice, that was not as a result of great academic achievements. It was other reasons. And I've been in and out of business schools doing teaching and a bit of research, but I am not an academic really, pretending to be, but very interesting in helping and being alongside people like you, as I have been throughout my career in different formats. So I'm going to run through, you know, just an outline. There's three basic subject areas on this question of how we can look for pathways towards engaging business practitioners with relevant research. I want to deal with some of the problems, just overview things that won't be particularly new to any of us, but will, I think, highlight some of the challenges that I know you're facing in terms of the dilemmas related to scholarly demands and academic demands, with also wanting to ensure that you have impact with your work. And of course, there's great impacts to be had. The needs are great, and business needs some really big solutions to some of the dilemmas it's facing. I mean, I'm involved with many sharp cookies, involved all kinds of research efforts, all practitioner based, all using a lot of digital input, managing huge quantities of data, servicing clients, and right close to businesses. And my hope is that increasingly we'll find that traction. So looking at problems, looking at the pathways through those problems. So there is some hope for you doctoral students out there. There are some interesting pathways emerging, and then practice. I'm going to open that up. We can all talk about that, but I will feature my own research work and practice in terms of, if you like, research that I hope has been relevant and published, not just in an academic sphere, but in practitioner press as well. So starting with the problems, let me just start off by giving you a little bit of an overview of some of the stuff that's out there. You may well have heard of this book that was published a few years ago. I think the titles almost speak for itself, but it's a book in which Max Alverson and a couple of others really try to address the problem of the cynicism amongst academics on the merits of academic research. So in their words, publishing comes to be seen as a game of hit and miss, of targets and rankings, crucial, but missing sometimes, crucial for academic careers, but not always so crucial for relevance. And they really felt, say that there's a premium to be content to kind of vacuum clean ever narrower areas of literature controlled by what they call micro tribes. And the problem of so much noise, so little to say is their opening chapter. A couple of other chapters in that book on loss of meaning. They've got two sections, loss of meaning and then the recovery of meaning, but just, the titles of the chapters say it all, and I've not read them all, but from science as a vocation to science as a game, institutions encouraging competition, instrumentalism and meaningless research is another chapter, methodologies and writings that turn into black holes of meaning. I mean, these are damning indictments and written by people who are within, struggling to have something meaningful to say. They've got quite an interesting model of three interlocking spheres of meaningfulness. ego, which is, I guess, each of us feeling like I need to have some significance in my role, in what I'm doing. I want to feel that I'm adding something. I'm purposeful. So there's the ego dimension, an appropriate ego dimension. There's an appropriate group dimension in that we have colleagues and peers in the particular domain of business and management that we are looking to, that we respect, that we want to be part of. So we have a group dynamic going on, but we also have a world. And what they're saying is that really these intraspheres of meaningfulness need to overlap such that we're hitting and meeting ego, group, and actually something relevant for the world as well. Perhaps easy to say, but very difficult given the structure of academic career at the moment. Now, recently, and I think it was, well, Ibrat can put me right, but probably only a few weeks ago, we had Andrew van der Ven doing one of these webinars, and I saw the recording of it. And this is just a sample of one of his slides that he gave to us in that call. So for those of you on that, this is, I hope, a building on some of the really interesting challenges that he brought in terms of how to engage scholarship for science and practice, and making the point that business people need academic research, and academic research needs business engagement, and pointing to the gap between theory and practice. So, you know, there's his slide with social science in deep trouble. Some of these statements will be are very familiar to you. The whole harking question comes up in terms of hypothesizing after the results are known. So some issues of ethical dubiousness in terms of ensuring that one gets the right number of citations on the H index, etc. So game playing that he highlights, and then he was really spending time on how to address those concerns. There's also another, I think, fairly influential piece that was written in the AMLE or published earlier this year by Dennis Turish, who has for many years been challenging the status quo in management studies. And his paper, The Triumph of Nonsense in Management Studies, has provoked a lot of debate and discussion, in which there was a subsequent issue in which responses to his paper were published. And to me, it is all upping the ante on the question of what are universities and business schools going to do to enable this going beyond simply the most important thing of rigor and relevance, of rigor, but getting it more and more relevant to target audiences and practitioners. There's a couple of quotes there from that paper, but give you a taste of what Dennis Turish's articles were about. And of course, the dilemma that we face of and quest for ongoing theory development, or disproving a theory, proving my theory, finding gaps within the theory, ensuring that I've got a model, and then ensuring that I have the statistical validation to, as best one can, support the theory that I have added to. So we know the requirement for that, and of course the academic rigor and respect and appropriateness for that element. But his comment is that the result of this writing can only be understood by those already on the inside of the debate it references, is one of the dilemma. So in a response to that paper, the AMLE then came up with a whole issue in which this is one that I found particularly helpful, only a short little article by Kai Peters and Howard Thomas, in which their response was about how do we end up in this position, and what can we do to change it. Are you all hearing, by the way, or clearing? I've not got any videos up at the moment, but I'm presuming you're all with me. Ibrat will no doubt tell me if there's a problem. I'm ready to take questions as we go, but I'll be pausing in a moment. So their point, which I found quite interesting, was the idea of the business school originally, and when it was developed, probably developing in the 50s in the US, was that this should be a professional school. Business people didn't have their own professional school, unlike medicine or law or even engineering. But as far back in 1967, Simon produced a paper that the business school was then should be a business school to bring the world of practice together with the disciplines, so that practical management problems then rub against theory, as opposed to theory running away from a point that it isn't actually rubbing against any real management problems, which is one of the dilemmas that we're facing, which I believe and see signs of being addressed, by the way. And so I found that quite an interesting thought, that we should be looking at ourselves as professionals, not just academics, in the world of business and management. So we can perhaps discuss that in a moment. But here's another quote from that paper that I wonder if I can get it up. They say, what we would really like as management educators is a situation in which academics do sound research and managers read that sound research, right? And I think later on, it'd be good to discuss and get your thoughts on how we can do the sound research with rigor, but then develop that sound research in a readable format accessible to managers, right? That, I think, if we can work at that, that will open doors and is opening doors to engagement, which is what we all are looking for. So here's another paper that has been quoted, in fact was quoted by, I think, Professor Mark Fisher, was it Ibrat, who also gave a talk in your webinars.
Yeah, Mark Jenkins.
Mark Jenkins. And he similarly was pointing to the real deficiency between addressing practitioner audiences. This paper came up then. It's a short Business Horizons paper, but you can see from the opening paragraph of that paper, the question is, surely the primary purpose of a business professor is to develop people and ideas for the business world, and to engage in practical disciplines focused on developing and sharing ideas to improve organizational performance. Well, amen to that. So on to say we need to repackage our research in ways that are memorable, understandable, and useful. And we need to share these insights in practitioner-focused outlets. And I think we need to go on to talk in our discussion about how we might make that possible. And I'd be interested to hear, by the way, from those of you who, straddle that gap to do exactly what Professor Fisher here says, which is how to write practitioner-focused articles that enable you to feel you're having impact in a way that you may not always find when you have to work on theory development. Here's an example of a practitioner article by two professors. I mean, we're talking 10 years ago now, about 2011, Nanaka and Takuchi, who were at the time, very well-known strategy professors. They wrote in the Harvard Business Review a paper on the wise leader and how CEOs can learn practical wisdom. And I'm going to talk about practical wisdom later on as a research tool. But here's just, again, a little quote from them to highlight the problem. We're still under the problem section. And it highlights this matter of the hypothetico-deductive theory, in which they point out the assumption that the theory-first approach assumes a world independent of context. Now, when we develop this session, I want us to talk about context being a really critical part of research, understanding context and providing a backdrop to some of the data that we have to gather in research. They make the point that, of course, all social phenomena are context dependent. Analysing them is meaningless unless you consider people's goals, values, and interests. There may be some debates around that, but nevertheless, that I thought was interesting, that there's a practitioner article, but they're also referencing a problem in academia. Now, I've got a blank screen up at the moment because this is a moment of pause. The first section is done. problems. I'm really keen if there's any either questions, but I hope we're going to co-learn from one another as we've got such an interesting audience of scholars from different parts of the world. So also very interested to hear your thoughts as well. So a little pause here. You can, Ibrat can step in if he wants to, if you've got anything there, Ibrat, that I haven't seen.
I just want to encourage, if you have any questions or want to say anything, share your perspective, please feel free to do so.
One of the questions that often comes up in these sorts of debates, and I'm on the International Advisory Board of a school in Canada, is where you've got a mix of practitioners and professors, is the professors will come and give us a little snapshot of their research, which we find absolutely fascinating. And then they sit and we say, well, have you got something to give us? And they'll give us a slide deck summary. But that's a mix of things that are really relevant and helpful I can take away, together with a lot of, some graphs and stuff that, not always easily understandable. But we love the interaction, and there's not very much a chance for that on both sides. So when we talk about the problems of relevance, the opportunity to be able to have a mix of practitioners who are thoughtful, professional, business people, managers, in a room with people who've really done some good work in studying what's going on has been a very useful thing. So I don't know if anyone's had any tips or experiences like that.
Melody, you raise your hand.
Yeah. This is a quick question. I mean, I had a look, Ebert, at the papers that you suggested that we read. One of the things I've found is that if I go off, say, and read a management book, you get what feels like folk wisdom, and then if that piques my interest, I will go back and try and find the relevant academic articles. But what I'm wondering is, do you think the core problem is the actual research? Because the research is pretty interesting, that I find most of the time, but it's it hasn't been translated. It's in Klingon and it's not in English. And so, the ones who bother to write in English are the ones who get my attention. And I keep wondering, and I don't know the answer to this, is it that we don't have enough Klingon writers translating into English, or is there actually a fundamental issue with the research itself?
Well, it'd be interesting to hear from others. I mean, I am a reviewer on a few journals, including the Journal of Business Ethics. So I do read what might be regarded as a little bit of Klingon. But I think I would go back to Dennis Turish, who's done an extensive review, and others like him, like Max Alverson, Yanis Gabriel. They've looked at papers, and of course there's the recent Academy of Management report, which I'll refer to later, that all come up with a similar point, saying that a lot of research is irrelevant. It's not that it's not translatable. In terms of the Max Alverson book, Dennis Turish says more and more published research is nonsense, meaningless, badly written, long-winded, and of little or no appeal to the public. It totally ignores the many pressing problems in the world that are clamoring for our attention. Now that feels a little bit harsh, but it does represent, I think, a degree of research modelling and elitism and micro-tribalism that I've in my various sort of discussions really is there. Now that's to be contrasted by also my experience that I've often been in a place of picking up really interesting research insights and then quoting them in, pithy presentations, which nobody, I might have in brackets, this was a great paper that was written, here and there, but they're not interested in it. They say, oh, well, that's cool. Well, where'd you get? I like the graph there. And I've got a friend, Adel Guitoumi, who's done a great work on, multi-level stakeholder analysis in supply chains. So it's fairly complex work, but he's got some great little Pareto diagrams which really work well. So I don't actually take any of the content around, you know, the explanation. I just take the diagram and I'll put that in the presentation. So I am doing a little bit of translating because there are some insights that are really good. So I think at one extreme, I see the Tourish Alverson campus saying, you know, this theory building is just nonsense in my criticism, and we need alternatives. And then I see some parts which think, this is really interesting and good, but it does need, exactly as you say, Melody, some translation. Any other comments on that?
Yeah, I think that the converse is also true. So you get, I come from practitioner background, but project management, for example, absolutely not recognized academically. The best star of a journal is a 2-star, and most of them are 1-star. And although the articles are very accessible, they're simply not, they have no bearing, and sometimes not enough quality research behind them. So it's almost like the other extreme, where it feels like if we could have a 3-star journal that that tried to balance the academic rigor with the practical accessibility, we would be in a better place. But that's perhaps getting onto the solution.
Yeah, we will get onto that. Thanks. I think that there are some. I mean, you guys will, you know, as the academics, and we're going to do, but we'll know more. But I think Business Horizons is a good example of what you're saying, where that seems to be pitching, not trying to get so into a 5-star, but probably 3-star, but really relevant and interesting, and they're increasingly others on the scene. And of course, Harvard's Business Review, which is a very well read, you know, business journal, and a lot of the McKinsey stuff, references in the background research, but tries to do a little bit of a job of almost pointing, well, there is some research over there, but actually, you know, this is how we interpret that research. A lot of that goes on.
Mm.
Great. Okay. Well,
Hi, Mike.
Sorry, another question?
Yeah, I have a small question.
Yeah.
So currently I'm working on a systematic literature review paper.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, do you have any tips or any ideas, any insights about how to make a systematic literature review more practitioner focused?
Wow, that's a question I'm going to be soon looking at smiling faces on the screen here to answer that one. Whilst you others get ready to answer that question, I would say I'd be limited to help there. I'm sorry I haven't got all the names up here. I've only actually got six pictures up on the screen. But when I write articles, and I'm co-editor of the Macau Reach Institute Journal, which is a quasi-professional practitioner stuff. And when we prepare those articles, we are encouraging practitioners who can write well. And when I write articles, I've just done one on the socialization of capitalism, for example. Now, in something like that, you know, you're totally bereft if you're not referencing the Financial Times, McKinsey, you know, a lot of practitioner research material that hasn't made it, nor has it been presented to academic journal press. But for the audience is absolutely relevant that you tick up the point that you are referencing, you know, known expertise in that sector that is relevant to that audience. So all I would say is that, you know, in a systematic, you know, literature review, you need to always think of the practitioner audience who you might like to talk to, if you get the chance to translate your research into something that they can read, and then find out what they're reading. I'll come to that a little bit later when we talk about my own research, where, you know, in fact, in India, I've published in Forbes India some of my research, and but it's all been condensed into about 500 words. But nevertheless, I've referenced Forbes India in that regard because it's relevant for the audience that I've been addressing, which is about wise management. Any other more, you know, academic responses to that excellent question? Advice?
I mean, I'd say, I mean, somebody who just finished doing an SLR, my impression is that, yeah, I guess we could approach doing an SLR with the practice in mind. And because SLR is driven, it's in itself a mini research project, or may not be mini, but it's a research project in its own right. And depending on the question we ask, I think that question can then guide how we structure our SLR and the kind of output that comes out of it. I suppose that would be my response to that.
I think it's inherently going to be quite theoretical by virtue of the fact that it's pulling together the theories of lots of other papers. So the most you can do from an accessibility point of view is improve the style of writing, and then wait for the next stage when you do your empirical work to add value from a practitioner sense.
Thank you, everyone.
So I was just going to add, I think it could be a flaw almost, because you're reliant on what the literature is saying, and if they're not identifying the problem, the management problem out there properly, then how do you get the practice perspective? Because they might, the literature might not necessarily focus on the practice perspective, which is a little bit of an issue that I've hit, I think.
Yeah.
Build on that. I think perhaps one of the other things is when you're positioning the problem, I think that's an opportunity to position it within that practitioner space. And then the other thing I was recommended to do was have a little team of people, and they're, you know, one academic, but also a couple of practitioners that I know quite well. And actually they're a great place that I just go and test out what it is that I'm thinking and thinking of saying. So that anchors, you know, it just helps.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I think just look out for.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, look out for some good practitioners that are in your field, and have conversations, keep in touch. I'll press on with section 2, where we move towards pathways on engaging practitioners with relevant research. And here is a reference to a recently published report by the Academy of Management's Practice Theme Committee, where they are, it's called Measuring and Achieving Scholarly Impact. And they have well rehearsed and well captured some of the thoughts that we've already expressed, some of the comments made by different professors and also doctoral research students in terms of what they call the grand challenges. And their concern, let me just give you a quote here from that piece. So scientific rigor and academic productivity are no longer a sufficient measure of the extent to which activities of researchers contribute to the teaching and practice of management. Now that seems quite surprising, but it was one of many different findings that came from this report, where they interviewed, I think, 700 academic members of the Academy of Management. Their challenges were really about how management research could be made more influential and have greater impact, and on how management academics can improve research relevance to the schools. Now, this is, again, as I've picked up a little bit of debate around this topic, and in fact, I think if I can click this, you can see this is one of a number of outputs from that, but I'm wanting to wind the screen down because those bullet points give you a quick overview of the proposals, really, if you like, the positive pathways under our heading of pathways of what could be done. And really building on Melody's point there about translating research for practitioners, this comes through strongly. And the other thing that they found was interdisciplinary research is definitely, or probably, more impactful than single disciplinary research, but of course more difficult to publish in the top tier journals. Now, some responses to that have said, well, actually some of the top tier journals are shifting their position. So the Academy of Management Journal launched a series of special issues and editorials, I think a few years back, aiming to address special issues over the last few years on societal or organizational issues, you know, sustainability, digital transformation, and so on. So there's some movement towards that. And of course, there is the development of some journals, which I think the Academy of Management Discoveries is one, where there's been an attempt to really draw in practitioner-focused research to the profession. So pathways, another interesting pathways comes from, we referred earlier to, there was a webinar just a couple of weeks ago hosted by IBRAT involving some key players in the RBBM network, which I'll mention in a minute. And in that webinar, Peter McKinnon, who's Professor of Management at Strathclyde Business School, gave an overview of some of his work, and I think he's published quite a bit in terms of how to help a way through this dilemma of needing to publish but wanting to have a kind of responsibility impact dimension to their research. And this is one of his slides where he's just put up three, and of course there are others, initiatives that are taking the turn towards a responsibility dimension in the way in which research is developed, including the Leiden Manifesto, which deals with the whole question of research metrics and offers the best practice into 10 principles, covering the use of both quantitative and qualitative measures to support expert judgment. And their fair data tool for that. Then there's the Declaration on Research Assessment by the San Francisco group. There's well known, of course, PRIME, the Principles of Responsibility for Responsible Management in Education, with their 8 principles. And then he also referred to what many of you may know of now as a developing network of scholars and professors and some practitioners like me involved in responsible research in business and management. And they've put a positioning paper forward on the principles of responsible science, of which there are 7 different principles. All of them seem relevant to this debate in terms of applicability, impact, and stakeholder engagement. I just pick out one there, sound methodology, to give you a sample, where they talk about sound methodology as principle 4, in which business research implements sound scientific methods and processes in both quantitative and qualitative, or both theoretical and empirical domains. And what they're wanting to develop, in fact, in that principle, is the opportunity that qualitative and quantitative research may also be developed through rigor in the ethnographic field, in other forms of research that has impact, and follows both, scientific methods, but also sort of lab field study methods as well, and integrates that into their idea of a sound methodology. Of course, ongoing debates on the hypothetico-deductive model, which is the whole theory building discussion. I'm just going to pause for a moment just to see if there's any questions or comments, or any comments on the whole sort of hypothetico-deductive model, and whether any of you are seeing alternatives to that sort of, if you like, mainstream method developing. I've got a few myself, but I'd be keen to hear from anyone on that. I think, is my connection okay, Ibrat?
Yeah, you froze a little bit just a moment ago, but I think it's okay now.
Sorry about that. I'm just suddenly aware that I may have just frozen. Okay, so just picking up here, I think some of the dilemmas that I encounter in this space of practitioner, academic, research, is that the business practitioner is not quite so engaged with, how you build the theory and the gap theory and prove. Whereas from an academic and from a rigorous and a quality research perspective, we know that needs to take place if we're doing research that needs to count. But the question really is, are there other methods and modes of quality research that may not be based on a hypothetico-deductive method. And of course, you know, we know that there are. The issue is, how do we get published in using methods that may not always be, if you like, mainstream, but are developing. And I'm specifically referring to things like autoethnographic research or ethnography generally, where you're actually engaged in the you're not just an observer, but you're actually engaging with the project itself. Be interested just to open this out a little bit before I move on, if there's any comments or questions on this this hypothetico-deductive model.
Mike, I don't know if it's the right time to ask this question, but in your slide, you're alluding to delving for rich description.
Yeah.
What is the benefit or advantage of rich description?
Yes. Again, I've picked this up through, I suppose, my own experience, but also some reading around this, where frequently a set research published paper has not got much narrative in it, and that's because it's designed not to have narrative in it, i.e., you know, explanation, field discourse, what we found. I understand that, but actually, what turns on you know, practitioner audiences in terms of action is, give me a case and tell me how they did it. You know, how did they do that? And what was it? Who were the people involved anyway? And what was the position? What was the challenge that they faced? What were the options that they faced? And why did they choose that option against the other? Now, obviously, I'm going case orientated there. And the great thing about cases is that they do offer, quotes, rich description usually of dilemmas that you face. But that doesn't easily fit with you know, models that one is dealing with extant theory, questioning maybe elements of the theory, or seeking to add to that theory and to demonstrate that what you're adding has got verification in terms of statistical research and data and so on to support the development. So they seem to me these two different tracks. Maybe I can develop that a little bit further by just clicking to the points here of, if you like, alternatives around the debate to talk about what do we mean by rich description. So there is a development in abductive research, in which I guess you start with, you know, do we really know? What do we really know? So perhaps a bit of grounded theory in terms of, you know, what can we know from an empirical perspective? What do we know just by the statement of the obvious? And then perhaps looking for startling facts or puzzles that present themselves through that, and not bending either to an inductive or deductive method, although maybe touching on it, but almost removing oneself on the need to be either inductive or deductive for grounded research, which may then turn into some theorizing down the lane. And to do that, there are narratives, there's field research, there's action research, in which we are dealing with people, we are giving quotes, we got a lot of, you know, heavy qualitative kind of grounded data. Similarly, ethnography, where we're looking at habitats and context for people and corporations. Phenomenology, a fairly ancient research method started by Edmund Husserl, I think turn of the century, but developed in all kinds of different ways, mainly in anthropology. But interesting, simply enjoying the observation and, if you like, the rich description, but not feeling any desire to turn that into theory. Nevertheless, you know, you can see the overlaps between these. And then something that I want to talk about from my own background is phrenesiology, or phonetic social science, which is bottom-up contextual and action-oriented knowledge, which again also requires description on things like axiology, you know, values, why there's these ingrained habits of personality, or what are they anyway, that we are observing in this culture or this context before we try to draw any conclusions. And in all of these, I think we're seeing signs that there are acceptable ways of publishing using these fields, but they're not the standard mainstream model. Any comments or questions on that before we press on? What Peter Bamberger said, by the way, in his response to Dennis Turish's article, was that he's noticed that over the last 5 or 6 years, the field, his field, which is, I think, organizational science, really, he says that has undergone what he has undergone an abductive revolution, with journals more open to different forms of theory development, one that is empirically rather than theory driven. And he references the Academy of Management Discoveries, but also other leading journals are also towing the line, such as Organizational Science, who recently published a conceptual paper on abductive reasoning, signaling that it recognizes the importance of empirically driven, as I put there, phenomenon grounded research. And he points to the fact that the value for these approaches, empirically grounded abductive research, goes beyond the value stems from going beyond the provision of qualitative descriptions by surfacing new concepts and linkages and plausible explanations to some of the puzzling anomalies that one sees. So I say this is under pathways to say, I mean, at least his experience is that certain journals are already opening up into abductive reasoning, which is a grand overall scheme, whether you do a bit of phrenesiology, ethnography, phenomenology, or anything else that is teasing out going beyond theory-based hypotheses, basically.
Mike, there's a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Young Jale is asking, how can we make phenomenon-driven paper correlate more with theories?
Phenomenon-driven paper correlate more with theory. I don't know how you do that. I mean, I think, you know, it'd be interesting to Thompson. I've not had to do that. I mean, I'm a practitioner, but what I've read around it is that if you have, I mean, you could use my own, which I'll talk to in a minute. I've found various things about, say, you know, how wise managers make wise decisions. Someone else could come along to that paper and say, hang on, you've got a bit of a model there, and I have got a model, but how can we develop that further? Well, I haven't done that, but somebody who is into, you know, theory building could take that, if you like, grounded level, in this case, phrenesiological sort of research, and say, there is the potential to develop theory here. You say, fine, I haven't done that, so I don't know how to do it, other than the obvious which way, where, you know, one has, you know, done the literature survey, find out who's saying what on the subject, which in fact I did do, but in that case I didn't choose to use any of the theories. There's a Sternberg theory, the Ardelt's wise balance theory of wisdom, and so on. I found them all interesting, but they weren't really relevant actually to what I was finding out. So I'm welcome to anyone else who might like to answer that question. Okay, you know, that is the challenge I put to you then, ladies and gentlemen. Phronesis, it's a word used by Aristotle and other Greek philosophers, really. They had a number of words for wisdom. Phronesis is a particular practical wisdom, and I use this because I'm now making a departure into, here is a pathway that's alternative to the hypothetico-deductive model. And he says, this is Aristotle from Nicomachean Ethics, it belongs to wisdom. Phronesis, to take counsel, to judge the goods and evils and all things in life that are desirable to be avoided, to use all available goods finely, to behave rightly in society, to observe due occasions, to employ speech and action, to have expert knowledge of all things that are useful. It seems a sort of very general catch-all thing that one would say, well, that all sounds great. What's interesting is that people like Bent Flivberg, David Rooney, Eikeland, a number of scholars have taken phronesis into what they call phronetic social science. And this book by Bent Flivberg was influential in terms of garnering support for an alternative way of doing social science, making social science Matter, which was published in 2001. And that's where the term frenetic social science emerged. Now, so right back in 2001, you know, he was basically, here's a comment by Schramm on the devastating critique that social science was hopelessly lost in seeking to emulate the natural sciences with a quest for theory-driven abstract knowledge of universal rationality. And then it explains the role of phronesis as something that social sciences can offer that the natural sciences cannot, with their emphasis on episteme and techne. Now, episteme is where we get epistemology, of course, which is, so we know about epistemology and ontology and development of knowledge. Techne is the know-how. How do we do something? What's the knowledge? But the other key word that is missing, that he feels social inquiry needs as an alternative to, if you like, the theory first model, is basing something on phronesis, or the frenetic social science, elsewhere called phronesiology, the study of practical wisdom. So the study of practical wisdom. Now, there's a whole smattering of phrases that I've taken from a number of the advocates of phronesiology, Flivberg, David Rooney, Clegg and Pitsis, Eikeland, Alverson, Conger, Barker. I mean, these are just a collection that I've picked up. Some of them look a little bit strange if you have a wander around those. I mean, there's the 3 points in the bottom right. Where are we going? Is this desirable? What should be done? That's Flivberg. So you can see it's practitioner orientated. What are we doing? What are we going to do? What are the goals? And give me some rich narrative, some narrative accounts, some cases. Give me the context. Tell me about the knowledge that I can tease out by the habitus, by the structure of the people, the society, the organization that I'm studying. Axiology, praxeology, and eudaimonia is in the bottom left. The axiology is I guess a study really of values and value, which you see in the Aristotelian account of practical wisdom. It's infused with how does one develop great character? What is really good in what is valued and valuable. Praxeology is, as you know, praxis, the enactment or application of knowledge to a particular, practical discipline. Eudaimonia less so, or sometimes called eudaimonia, the English word, or version of it, which is literally it's flourishing, it's fulfillment, it's well-being. So you get this mixture of narrative, or looking at how people make decisions, why they make the decisions. It's dialogical in terms of its approach, and wants to be relevant. That's phronesiology. And I think what Flivberg says, that conventional view holds that theory precedes action in the top-down movement, when one arrives at whatever the right action is by first choosing the right theory and then applying that theory properly to the practical question at hand. For example, engineers applying the laws of physics and so on. His point is that frenetic social scientists are critical of that view in relation to social, political, business, organizational behaviors. As such, action requires a knowledge of context that's simply not accessible through theory alone. And that takes us back to the observation by Nanaka and Takuchi in the Harvard Business Review article that was saying without context, it's meaningless. So we need context. And a frenetic research approach is primarily qualitative, but it actually gives context. And so phronesiology becomes, for someone like David Rooney here, his battle cry. This is him pointing the finger at a class that I had him and Bernard McKenna at in CIBS in Shanghai many happy years ago. But David Rooney has put forward and practiced phronesiology to move away from epistemology and the theory of knowledge to theory of phronesis or practical wisdom. And we can talk about him a bit more actually, because he's done some interesting work, but so has these guys here, Todd Landman, Sandra Tram, Bent Fidberg, again, another book called Real Social Science, in which they're pretty strong in repudiating some of the positive models of social science as we have it. So frenetic social science is concentrated on producing research that helps make a difference in people's lives by focusing on what it would really take to make the difference on the issues that matter most to people. So phronesis, I'm sort of racing through this a bit. Welcome to come back in discussion, because it's an area that is really interesting for me. But I'll take a pause as I've rushed through a few points there, and maybe there's some points of clarification, questions, comments, which I'll take right now before moving on to the final section, which is practice. So, the stunned silence on phrenesiology. Anyone going to take up the challenge of phrenesiology, not epistemology, which means that you know, you do a bit of praxeology, which enacts the application of knowledge, a bit of eudaimonia. It all can sound a bit vague, but there are some interesting. Some of the professions, I noticed some of the health professions have used frenetic social sciences in, there's a book by Kinsella and Pittman, edited by Kinsella and Pittman. I can't remember what the title is, but where they put together a number of healthcare research studies done with frenetic social science. And I came across one the other day that is currently in press, or is to be published, again using frenetic social sciences. So I'm seeing signs of this. Obviously, you can just search David Rooney and Fidberg and some of these, and you'll find some examples of this. And I'm going to give my own example in a moment, but I don't want to just madly press on unless there's any burning questions, or perhaps any additions to say, well, what about this? You know, I've given you a few in terms of different pathways that I think, as I've said, certain journals are accepting some variations, and you know, well, Academy of Management for Exploration, you know, these are good journals. So I think we're seeing some movement to allow others. Journal of Business Ethics is a little bit more open.
Mike, can I just ask a quick question? I see that Bent Fidberg in his paper adds a fourth dimension in, which is who gains and who loses, and by which mechanism of power. So I guess, you know, we all work in power structures, and, you know, publishing is definitely that power structure. It was interesting that, so I'm just curious about what your view is on that fourth dimension that he has there.
On who gains and who loses, I don't really know the answer to that question. So I think I know that a lot of his work was about trying to rebalance what he would regard as unfair power structures, but I'm afraid I don't know how I'd answer that. I don't know if anyone else does. You've read some of his work?
No, I just happen to have got one paper, and it mentions the three things around where are we going, what should be done, and is this desirable? But then there was a fourth, who gains and loses and power mechanisms.
Yeah, I have got that paper, but I have to admit it's been some years since I've read it. He's done a number of papers that came off on the back of that 2001 book. And he does write about power structures and inequality of power structures and how that might be redressed by frenetic social science. But I'm afraid, you know, drawing a blank here. So
yeah, it was a paper it was the 2007 paper. On frenetic organisational research.
If time allows, before the time limit is up in the discussion, I might try and dig it out and we can all have a look at it and see what he was talking about.
Mike, there are a couple of questions in the chat.
Yeah.
First one is from Vikas Prabhu. I wonder if phrenesiology relates to or borrows from William James' pragmatism in any way.
You wonder, could you repeat that, please?
If phrenesiology
Yeah.
relates to or borrows from William James's pragmatism in any way.
Okay. I haven't seen any reference to William James in any of the stuff that I've read on phrenesiology. That's not to say, you know, that I mean, obviously he's a philosopher. Pragmatism, you could say, well, there's a bit of, you know, praxeology in that, but certainly no explicit references to William James in any of the papers and so on that I've looked at, I'm afraid, no.
And then another question, are there some social science, sorry, the question from Lekha Waria, are there some social science topics that really blend well with the phrenesiology? I'm thinking of the wide field of sustainability. Yes,
that's a really great question, because one of the things that phrenesiology enables you to do is to go interdisciplinary because you're starting from habitus, context, and a puzzle and a challenge directly, rather than starting from a point of theory. That does absolutely give you certain spheres. So I think the organizational sciences and organizational psychology probably in different ways do play around with concepts of phrenesiology in trying to describe context. And something like sustainability and the challenges of climate risk, climate change, energy, carbon, sustainable agriculture, sustainable chemistry, all these fields are demanding an inquiry with a very open question, in which is quite difficult at this stage, I think, in a lot of these things to develop theory. So it's not to say that, you know, theory could develop further down the road, but the initial inquiry in which one is looking at a bottom-up approach primarily, an inquiry that takes you into dialogue with those who are practitioners at the coalface of the challenge, for example, of how do I measure the actual carbon imprint of a particular widget in an IKEA desk? I need to know that. It is a challenge, it's a thing. So the inquiry then is on what is the need to know? How is it communicated? How is that widget and its carbon footprint measured? And why do you need to know that? Well, I need to know it because it might be, I have a lower carbon footprint if I source it from Slovakia than if I source that same item from Italy. So I'm giving you a bit of a precise example, but so phrenesiology engages in a dialogical manner and a context. It can start with simply, it's primarily about open questions, truly open questions that have not been informed by a hypothesis, have not been informed by theory, but have been created as a result of a puzzle or a dilemma that faces society that requires answers. And initially those answers are not necessarily going to be formulated in a theoretical way, but rather, a description, a case of what's happened. And then a series of those cases, we might find patterns. We might then develop a model in which we can approach, for example, looking at a value chain and identifying how many stakeholders are in that value chain. Well, at the outcome, if you're going to develop the theory, we first of all need an inquiry into the number of stakeholders involved in the value chain, why they are stakeholders, how they qualify for stakeholders, how they are viewed, how they relate to one another. Do an inquiry on that, of which phrenesiology is a great tool. I'll just press on to the final section, then we can have a bit more discussion for the remaining time. But this is simply practice. And this is really the only sort of real main bit of research I do all sorts of different research. In fact, I've got any hints on developing stewardship codes right now would be very useful, but that's another project, and I'll use phrenesiology for that. This is one I did based on research that I did at the China Europe International Business School when I was there for 4 years. So it was concluded in 2012, 2013 maybe, resulted in a number of publications. So the reason I'm showing you this is to show that, particularly the discussions I've had with Ibrat and others about the dilemmas of doctoral scholars, is okay, I've got to publish something that will stand up in terms of the correct scientific rigor that's required for the journals and where I need to get published. But how do I use this to have something that's impactful, and can I get a hearing anywhere else? The answer is absolutely yes, you can. It may not have the same, H-index scores and so on, but it nevertheless, they reach audiences that are read by at least some professionals in business and management, and more importantly, are then taken and reproduced in bite-sized chunks in practitioner type formats. So when we talk about practice, I think it's research that has been turned into practice and then published in practitioner channels, but hopefully also give you the chance to do something that, if it's not theoretical, but certainly has a research quality that's relevant to get published in some of the, should we say, the more open and less elitist journals, if I can be, if I can say that. This is one chapter that was, had a number of publications, but where I published the full report. I don't intend to go into the, haven't got time to go into the full thing. You're welcome to, I can send you more details on this. What I wanted to do is to say, well, it was an inquiry that I carried out with 182 C-suite executives all around the world. And as a result of that, here are some of the publications that I got from that. It's not just, and you'll see it's a mixture there. There's a mixture of book chapters and a few articles. But in terms of the real impact of that research, it was through my presentations, which I've done on wisdom, and even this year still doing stuff on wisdom in Indian business schools, in Canada, in China. I've used the research in a very bite-sized format. I'm going to give you a sample of how it looks. So another health warning, practitioner stuff about to come, and potentially, oversimplify everything, which is what we do, I'm afraid, but there you go. But I want to say that behind that, there is actually some research that stacks up against the phrenesiological approach. So what we did was interviewed 182 senior business executives. There was some face-to-face interviews, but most of it was email or it was form filling. About half were Chinese and half were Western. And there were actually 3 questions, not the 2 there. That's the 2 for the sort of the simple take on all this. But there were 3 questions. What does wisdom mean for you? Management decisions are generally acknowledged as requiring fact-informed knowledge and a rational approach. In your experience, can you describe how wisdom might add something more to the decision-making process? How might someone acquire wisdom? Now, those questions came from practitioners, actually, from a panel that came, so look, this is what's interesting to us, because I thought option 3 didn't really fit, but they wanted that in, so I said, okay, let's put it in. So you can see no science behind the question, but simply very open questions, and no limit to how they could be answered. So I've just given you a little, taste or picture in terms of, here's the spreadsheet with these are the Chinese responses. We did some healthcare execs, and let's see, so it's all dumped basically and then coded according to categories that I'll come on to explain. The categories were partly from these executives. Now they're C-suite, so or they were they owned their own businesses, and I did the demographic breakdown and a turnover breakdown. Most of them were over 60 million euro turnover companies, some larger, some smaller, and the answers to the 3 questions are there. They're coded. There was, as you can see, a lot of Chinese as well in that. So let me see if I can get back to. So there were these 3 questions, and there was a Lexi Manson map that gave me and colleagues a chance to look at how the 17,000 words were sort of crunched and gave us indications of categories. But I want to just, rather than go deep much into the research, that I can talk about that in the discussion, is just to show how I've used it, typically in practitioner type presentations. So the chapter that I referred to earlier is if you like, the full account. But here are typical slides that I would use in a practitioner presentation to show how simplified you have to go, I think, with some of these things. So I could give a few survey snapshots here, comments that were made where I'm trying to illustrate in fact, what came out of were 5 different categories of wise decision making. Here are a few quotes, the one in the bottom right is illustrative of one of the points that you observe when you look at wise decision making, is that so many of the managers were referring to gut feel, intuition. So you have this interesting balance between rational, fact-based as being, part of a wise person is that you look at facts, but another interesting part is the way in which they are using their intuition or their experience or their insight to develop a decision. So it's a combination of both the rational, but also in this case, in the top left, softer, intangible elements. And there were references, interestingly, to values, concepts of fairness and integrity, being humane. So a whole cluster around, if you like, ethical skill, as well as rational capability, intuitive capability, and pragmatism. And so there's 5 models in the paper, but typically for a presentation, I'd look at top lines on what is wisdom. Well, it's an integrating capacity which brings additional valuable perceptual characteristics into managerial decision making. All of these can then be spelt out. It's interpreting, an ability to read and interpret a particular context for a decision as distinct from any known facts. Wisdom may in fact challenge known facts. Then there's this concept of sensing, which touches on the intuition, the ability also to be self-aware and aware of the other person, extrapersonal sensitivity. They're the 5 capacities, not done in a classic research paper format, but trying to, is actually taken from one of the practitioner publications that somebody drew this up for me. The rational capability, if you like, the intuitive insight, perception, ethical skill, pragmatism. And then another element that came through was emotional and ego regulation, the ability to be calm in crisis, to navigate uncertainty with equanimity, and to deal with surprises in a way that's measured, to be able to read yourself and to control yourself. So being wisdom conscious and decision making, so extrapolating again from the research findings, and obviously engaging and using my own engagement with, if you like, the subjects and the material, drawing out things that I think would be relevant to the particular audience that I'm talking to, which for a manager, a leader, a business leader, is about presence. There's a quote here. I would then draw in other practitioners to kind of bolster some of the points. So here I'm using not only what came from the survey, but saying, oh, by the way, Tony Schwartz said this about challenges, things that don't serve your most immediate self-interest. So it's awareness of others, managing yourself, being complementary rather than competitive, poise, which is about resisting being reactive, practice being, alternative decision-making processes, managing facts, data, and reasoning. So that's it, really. I mean, giving you a bit of a smattering there, but we've got a little bit of time. If Ibrata, you want to open up discussion in the remaining 10 minutes.
Yes, please. Yeah, I mean, if there are any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or you can type it up in the chat and I can read it out. Whilst people are thinking about their questions, Mike, I had a question. You talk about wisdom, but how do you reconcile the idea of wisdom up against the notion of knowledge, or maybe even information that we're so obsessed today in both in the society and even in the management research?
Yeah, well, that was one of the drivers to the research, actually, because I think when you are in management, there is a very strong emphasis on fact-based decision-making, right? And basically, if you're going to be a cool professional manager, fact-based decision-making, rationality. Now, I'm a director of a couple of companies, and, in discussion and debate, of course, you have to have facts. That's not in debate. The issue is about the way in which people will prioritize facts, when some issues, we don't have the facts, we don't have the data, we don't have the knowledge. So what are you going to do? So you keep looking for facts, and you sometimes end up bringing in facts that are not relevant to answer the question directly, but are nevertheless some facts, because it's fact-based. So we have a predilection, and it's peculiarly Western. I mean, I've worked in China for a while, so you observe a peculiar predilection in the West, that we have to have data and facts and knowledge, and of course we do. So as I don't want to say that, I mean, I work for a company that collects loads of data, but it's all about interpretation, its context, its application, its relevance of the data and the information. Where do you get that from? So this is where the question of wisdom comes in. Does wisdom add something more than simply the rational capability of information and knowledge? And in the research that came out from the 17,000 words that we got back from various responses, it clearly does, because whilst there was plenty of mentions on processing data, facts, application of knowledge, objectivity, reason, that was all there in the data. But there was a whole lot of stuff that was not about knowledge. It was something else. And we were trying to map, what is that something else? So intuition comes out. A number of them talk about gut feel, experience, consciousness, foresight, spirit, heart, voice within, and these are managers, serious managers. Some of them I showed that obviously have hidden some of the companies, but big, well-known brand companies. They're people who've done well in their career, but some of them were referring to like spiritual values, ethical values, things that are not per se epistemological. So ethical skill. Then there's competences or capacities, the ability to solve problems. I might have lots of knowledge, but is that enough to be able to solve the problem, to make a decision? What is it that's involved in a decision? Well, I might have the knowledge, but I still have to make a decision. So what informs that decision? And this is where wisdom comes in. And what are the dimensions of wisdom? Well, it's about self-awareness, awareness of the other, ego regulation, and an appreciation of the aesthetic nature of life, as well as the hard rational data. So there is this mix, I think, Ibrat, between using knowledge, but saying something beyond just epistemology, which is why David Rooney calls for, something more than epistemology, phrenesiology, praxeology, ontology, eudaimonia, and so on.
Thanks, Mike. There are a couple of questions in the chat. Melody is asking, by wisdom, do you mean emotional intelligence, or is there something more?
It's not really the same as emotional intelligence, but it does include emotional intelligence. So I've got two sources here. There's obviously organizational psychologists and general psychologists like Hannah Arendt that have done a lot of study on wisdom. Emotional intelligence definitely is a feature of wisdom, but it's not just, and this is the thing, wisdom is an integrative capacity in which, of course, a wise person you wouldn't imagine, flies off the handle, loses their temper and readily. I mean, it's somebody that may have an up and down emotion, but is able to control it. It's the capacity to control. So emotional intelligence, in course, it incorporates self-awareness and the awareness of the other. These are features of wisdom. But also features of wisdom are the ability to integrate fact-based knowledge and a rational approach together with looking for outliers that don't fit the rational approach. So an openness to what, if you like, foresight. Foresight is a combination of forecasting and insight. Now, that can be informed by data. You can look at data trends, but it requires something that data won't give you. I mean, data can give you, you can get trend data, but we know from the recent COVID crisis that any number of trend data could happen. But an interpretation and an ability to forecast or have foresight takes some other capacity. So it includes emotional intelligence, but not exclusively.
Another question in the chat is from Lekha. How easy may it be for a twin country study like this with respect to phonesiology? Cultural differences may create challenges in creating codes for qualitative studies, which bind thoughts and values from different parts of the world. Am I wrong in thinking so?
No, this is exactly right. And of course, we are looking at the dilemma. The paper goes into more detail on this, but of course, we had half of the respondents were Chinese. I think 96 and but 80 odd were Western. And you're absolutely right. So you can, and in fact, in the paper, I'd actually have to split Western and Chinese responses to some of the questions because, firstly, you have to go. The concept in Chinese of wisdom is je hui. Je hui already incorporates both rationality and intuition. It's a combination of the two already. So the word itself brings together two of the basic concepts that we pick out. And it's often associated with a rational approach, je hui. And I don't know if we've got any Chinese on the call, they can probably help me out here. We did notice a skewing in the Chinese responses towards a more rational, fact-based idea of wisdom. But that came in, there were three different components of it. And when we of that, you know, facts, I think rationality, and there was a third one I can't remember quite right at the moment. I have to check it out myself. But when you combine them together, they come out pretty much the same. Western and Chinese balance. There was about 60% of respondents were that was like 68% were referring to knowledge fact-based as an important priority. But the point was we had to decompose. We only did it Chinese and Western. We didn't really, you know, do other culturals, but we had to explain cultural difference. And to do that, we had to go into, well, I had to go into the Mandarin wording to explain and give context to understanding. And that, I think, is part of the task for kinesiology, which is about context. So absolutely important factor. Thank you.
There's another question Melody asked earlier. There's a domain of research examining wicked problems, which are complex. Does phonesiology work well with such problems?
Yes, and in fact, usually in my slides, I depict a wicked problem. And in fact, the last one I did on this, COVID was the wicked problem. And I did a case on here's a COVID situation as absolute wicked problem. How do we use wisdom and apply that to this wicked problem? So yes, and in fact, in the book that I've done, management, wise management in organizational complexity, which I published 5 years ago, which is a collection of papers. One of the papers by Jay Adams was on wicked problems and complexity and how wisdom approaches that. So phonesiology does attempt to be able to approach a wicked problem because it's not defined. So you're going into space that's not been defined. It's known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And phonesiology isn't requiring anything more than you going and answering questions and extrapolating what you're finding, and maybe you're spreading out a bit of a smorgasbord, as I've done just there with the wisdom stuff, which gives us clues as to what's involved in the wicked problem, but is not, doesn't necessarily answer the wicked problem, but gives insights, and it's a way of exploring a wicked problem.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Any other questions?
May, Ibrat,
Please.
Mike, wisdom is idiosyncratic and it relates to experience, and different people have different experiences. So coming back to the COVID-19 challenge, those guys are at the top of the organizations, at the top of states, right? Tried and still try to resolve this based on the wisdom. So Donald Trump has his own wisdom. If you remember, in February he said it will disappear like miracle, right? So Vladimir Putin has his own wisdom on that. So he didn't comment on this issue for a while. All right. So President Alexander Lukashenko has his own wisdom. He said it doesn't exist at all. So if you feel uncertain about that, go and work or drink some vodka. So also, it looks like Swedes decided they will relate to knowledge and data and science instead. All right. So it looks like they did a better job than wisdom. Right. So what do you think? Whose wisdom is better in this situation? Trump's, Putin's, Lukashenko, Swedes, or that lady in charge of New Zealand?
Yeah, I think the way I would approach that is to just work through the findings of not just my own work in wisdom, but others' work in wisdom, and just go through. For example, you take Donald Trump's pronouncement in February, there is no problem. So you look at wisdom. Is that a wise statement to make? Question mark. Well, the first thing is look at the wise capacities that were on the slide earlier. One of them, if I get it up, I might be able to get them up. If I get them, 5 wise capacities. There we are. So the first question is rational capability. So is there fact-based reasoning apparent in the judgment and the statement that Donald Trump made? Question mark. If it is, what are the facts? What is the data that he has used for that presumption? The second thing is, to what extent is his insight and intuition been at work, and the appropriateness of that insight, intuition, if you like, experience is another. There's a number of words around this, but it's basically saying, I've got insight and intuition that's informed by some experience that I've had, something that has given me that capacity to interpret in a particular way. What is that, Donald Trump, that you have used to interpret any data to come up with? Let us see what it is. Ethical skill. Has there been a consideration of the ethical impact of what your statement might be in terms of its result? Is it a verifiable and responsible position to take by, if you like, your average, cross-section of people who are going to come up with some sense of what is valuable to society and how is society, what is a humane response, and so on. So you'd work with pragmatism, how, what's been the decision-making process behind that statement? To what extent have you managed your own ego in that process to make an unself-interested judgment? Is the judgment unself-interested because you've managed your ego? So, and you could similarly to the others that you've mentioned. And in fact, by the way, I had the Prime Minister of New Zealand up as an example of wisdom in a recent seminar. So you go through those 5 things, and to me, she ticked the box in the way she'd managed the COVID crisis. I'll leave you to judge whether the other people that you mentioned would tick that box. But you're trying to look at an objective, semi-objective, sort of informed way of saying what this is wisdom, or capacities of wisdom, and how does a decision that's apparently been someone's personal match up to something that we've seen from a cross-section of people make up an understanding of wise capacities, the capacities of wisdom. So that's how I would approach that dilemma.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Mike. I think most of the people I mentioned in my example don't really tick those boxes. The problem is that their statements based on the reference to wisdom resonate to the wisdom of people who probably elected them. All right. So, and those people don't really tick those boxes either. All right. So
yeah.
The problem is that with your legitimizing wisdom, right? You give freedom to those people to refer to wisdom instead of operating with rigid facts and knowledge that we are trying to create in academia. So I feel the threat. Despite the fact I really support, your approach, so I feel the threat of sliding down to shamanism. All right, so there is a spiritual leader who claims his connections to the gods or whatever, and he says the wisdom says we need to follow this direction. And you see what I mean?
I do, and I think what we have to do is to say, look, how does your concept of wisdom match up with the history on the subject of wisdom, the philosophy of wisdom, organizational studies, our own knowledge of wisdom, and however it's captured. I've just given you one version. I mean, you can go to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which is really how you develop character. And there's plenty on the virtues and vices, which you can use as a benchmark to say, well, where am I on the wisdom scale? So one of the questions which we asked, which is how to develop wisdom, is actually another research project. I mean, we did get some responses to it, but I think the idea that you can claim wisdom is really is for others to make that claim rather than you to make that claim for yourself. And the way that we tend to look on that, and sometimes in a class I've said, who do you consider to be a wise leader? I remember doing that in Korea, in South Korea at the Seoul National University doing a course, and all sorts of names come up. I only knew one of them, but they were all well known in South Korea. So each culture had its own sense of who they would perceive to be wise. But when you then ask the next question is, well, why do you think they're wise? What makes them wise? You get into the kind of territory that I've just illustrated here.
Great, thank you very much, Mike.
Okay, any perhaps final thoughts or questions to Mike before we finish? I guess that's it then. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Yes, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. It was really interesting.
Great to be with you all.
Thank you very much.